Well, hello, and here we are trying to make up these lectures because we had that great day with our guest speakers. So what we're talking about today is, let's see, this is lecture 6, so this is victims and victimization. I want to begin by reminding you that we talked about the unified crime reporting. And unified crime reporting was statistics collected by the FBI from local police departments. Those statistics then are compiled and give us a lot of data about how crime is committed in the United States. But we kind of left off with that point, are all crimes reported? And you guys volunteered a lot of reasons why they may or may not be reported. And this gets to an interesting issue when we're trying to assess crime, because how much crime is actually reported, how much crime goes unreported. So we look, and if you're looking at your slides, the National Crime Victimization Study, sponsored by the U.S. Department of Justice, and the idea is it's a survey, very similar to census, where people are called and they enroll in the program, and they report on victimization that they may have encountered. So this is a nice way to do things, to give us a second view at what crimes might be committed. So I hope you don't mind I sat back. Boots wants to sit down. So say hello, Boots. Hello, Boots. All right. So what can we say? Let's talk about the victimization then. Let's talk about the differences in the two reports. So, or not. I'm going to cycle back here a little bit. I know this is rough as hell. Sorry about that, guys. So, they provide good estimates, both the UCR and the NCVS, but they tap into different things. And what we see that many crimes are unreported. We can look at 49% of violent crimes were reported, 40% of property crimes were reported. This is half, or slightly less than half that are actually reported. And you know the reasons because you guys already volunteered the reasons. So, what this tells us, though, is tells us that people are not always willing to report. Take it for what it is, and let's not go beyond that. Next coming up is hate crimes and victimization. Hate crime is a relatively new idea. The idea between hate crimes is if there's special circumstances involved in the crime, if the crime was motivated by hatred, then additional penalties may be available, or someone could be charged with a more severe crime. This is a controversial topic, and it's something that we will be with for a while. Some people will simply argue, well, if someone's already been charged and convicted of murder, what good does adding an extra charge or a special circumstance to the crime add? It certainly makes people feel that the justice system is responding to their needs, and that's an important point that we'll be talking about throughout the course. Now, let's shift gears and let's move to this idea of sexual harassment. Now you can see in the slides before 74 harassment didn't exist. If we look at estimates of incidents of sexual harassment, you go to surveys, federal employees 42% report sexual harassment. Female lawyers in large law firms report high levels of harassment, 43%. We also, when we can think of personalities that engage in certain professions or are more likely to move towards certain professions, we can see where that might be a problem. Female graduate students, as you can see, 60% have reported sexual harassment, and that's a pretty big number. Now, the Civil Rights Act of '65 provided a legal basis, a way to outlaw it. The EEOC is responsible for the enforcement. Now, what is the EEOC definition? And this is where it gets important. It's a real, I mean, if we want to stay on the right side of the law, it's pretty simple. It's pretty darn basic. Unwelcome sexual advances, verbal or physical, if this is used as a condition of employment, that is, either you accept my advance or you get no job, and this could be either explicit, like stated, just like I did, or we might know from past history in a workplace that people don't become promoted or don't get jobs unless they produce certain sexual favors for the people making the hiring decisions. That is, the submissions are tied to employment decisions. So, if it reasonably interferes with work or creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment, it can be considered sexual harassment as well. and intent is not necessary. Right? So here we move maybe from the golden rule to the platinum rule, as we discussed in class. Do unto others as you would believe they want to have done unto them. And if you're uncertain how people want to be treated, what the heck, you could always ask them. I know, that sounds pretty strange, but it is possible. So the courts then divide sexual harassment into two different types. Quid pro quo, simply sexual demands in exchange for employment benefits. This is sexual coercion, straight up, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Now, hostile workplace harassment perhaps is more pervasive, and there may be less intent tied to it. So it could be something as simple as unwanted attention. And I was very curious about this idea when I was working part-time at the law firm while I was in graduate school. And I did a little study. I mean, it was a one-up. There's no replication, so let's just take it for what it is. But I had some people rate attorneys on attractiveness, and we looked at the attractiveness and then recorded the number of visits to their desks per day. And the more attractive the female attorney, all else being equal, the more visits they had during the day, the more attention they received. Now, to the extent that this attention is unwanted, let's say ogling, let's say someone's talking to you and doesn't seem to be able to make eye contact, but does a really good job of making eye-to-breast contact, you know, this is becoming unwanted attention, and that is prohibited. For the guys often feel insecure, they don't know how to behave, that they might be guilty of sexual harassment. Here again, guys, we can adopt the platinum rule and just behave in a way that people want to be treated. And if someone spurns your advance or suggests that they don't like your attention or the way you're behaving, then the onus is on you to change. Right? And this is a tough thing for guys. Remember, for all of you, let's remember that men, and I know I'm being stereotypic, and if you want to call me sexist, that's okay in this regard, but many men are raised with the mantra, don't take no for an answer. And this is good business, right? That we keep trying. If first you don't succeed, try again. As this is applied to encounters between romantic encounters or potential romantic encounters, you can see where it can go awry. That is, I don't want your attention, I'm not interested, I said I'm not interested, I don't want to have to repeat that I'm not interested, leave me the hell alone. So for a lot of us, we just need to understand that no does in fact mean no. Okay? Yeah. Can you predict who's more likely to sexually harass? And there's data on this. I don't know that the real world application is so useful. I don't know, you bring everyone in, give them questionnaires, and then predict who's going to harass and watch them. Did we engage in a self-fulfilling prophecy? Maybe, maybe not. Regardless, some men are more likely to harass than others. What do we see? Well, we see more acceptance of myths about rape. Talk more about that later. More coercive sexual fantasies, so some of their arousal is linked to using power to achieve their desired end. They may have more stereotypical beliefs about sex roles, the male sex roles as dominant and women being submissive. And this leads often to behaviors where they have a strong need to dominate women and a strong need to seek out sexual contact. That is, many men in this category have multiple attempts to dominate multiple women. So, now what can we do? Well, first thing we can do to diminish sexual harassment is make the environment less friendly and less supportive of sexual harassment. At the paper mill, you know, once we started sexual harassment training, and there was a lot of jokes from the guys at the mill. You know, this is old school stuff. They say, oh, sexual harassment training. Is that going to teach me how to sexually harass better? No, sorry, it isn't. It's going to tell you what the law is and how to stay within the law. Sounds like we're having a minor cat disturbance. No big deal there. So we did a kind of a hygiene study. You go around the mill, and any place you see stuff that can be construed as sexual explicit or even implicit material, you remove it. You don't put Playboy centerfolds hanging up on the walls, not even in the lockers, people's private lockers. This is a place to work. This is not a place to entertain sexual innuendo or fantasy. You know, if parties get a little risque or their sexual behaviors connected with the workplace, this can be bad. Again, at that same said law office I worked at, believe it or not, there's a couple, I can remember one time that they did a lot of drinking after hours, a lot of happy hours, and after drinking one happy hour, a couple of us were lassoed, corralled, and we ended up at a strip club. And I remember getting a handful of singles, you know, just shoved in my hand from one of the attorneys. The expectation was that we were going to go do this. Probably not a good idea for the workplace and bosses and employees to be mixing in such a way. And I found it fascinating that this was a law firm where this was occurring. So clean up the environment, right, and any kind of stimuli that primes sexual motivation could probably be eliminated. That would be a good step. Remember, this is an association. It's classical conditioning, straight up Pavlovian conditioning. If someone comes to assimilate, to associate some stimulus with the sex act or the pursuit of a sexual partner, then those stimuli in the environment can cause the associations to trigger, and then the subsequent behavior follows. So to the extent that we can control the stimuli, it might help some people. We have to talk about battered women for a minute. Statistics vary kind of widely on the level of battery. Maybe a third to a half of American women have been battered, abused at some point in their lifetime. Now, we often stereotypically assume that the man is the batterer and the woman is the victim, but statistics show that it's a 50-50 proposition. Women are as likely to batter men as men are as likely to batter women. The big difference is men tend to be stronger, they tend to be larger, and because of this, men tend to do greater damage if they engage in a battering situation than women do. And here's a frightening statistic. Women are 3.7 times more likely to be killed by their stranger than their partner. And we talk a lot about terrorists and are concerned about being attacked by terrorists, but you know, one of us being attacked by a terrorist in the United States, this is a minuscule probability. It doesn't even approach the probability that we'll be attacked by our romantic partner. It's shameless self-promotion. I'm going to talk about this in Psych of Emotion as well as how emotion is used to cause us to react to what we read, and how emotion guides policy, and sometimes very strangely indeed. Certainly not supported by statistics or need. So what do we say about battered women? A lot of people will take the general approach that battered women deserve it, that they're masochists, they provoke assaults, they got what they deserve, right? They're free to leave at any time, so if they're being battered, they must secretly somehow enjoy it. And of course, women are not free to leave. Often they're tied very strongly to their partner for security, for income, for child care, etc. Some people believe that violence isn't that common. Well, we've seen the statistics and it is relatively common. Some people say that men who are not violent with other men, let's say, don't, pick bar fights or whatever, aren't going to go home and be violent, and that's not correct at all. We can look at ideas of like Freudian displacement. Often people, will harbor a great deal of hostility and aggression and find that the target they would like to direct it towards is an unsafe target. A police officer, a boss, someone bigger. So we know through displacement, the urge doesn't go away to aggress, it just shifts targets. That is, we shift to a safer target to fulfill the need to aggress. So that would be like totally Freudian. Some people say it's only a low SES or minority problem, and we've talked about that in class before. It's easy to paint a picture of minorities as having problems that are different from the wealthy or the middle class, and I think that's a dead-end road for us to travel down. Best that we just treat this as a problem that exists at all socioeconomic levels and across all races. Now, exceptions there are certain cultures do allow for greater levels or expectations or reactions to wife battering or beating. Some people will entertain, and this is our last one, the idea that battered women are passive, they never try to defend themselves. That's probably true in a minority of cases. I think more likely many women have attempted to defend themselves and found that it escalated the level of violence. So their strategy that they learn over time for self-defense is to not fight back, but to endure the battering and get out with a minimal battering as a result of that. The problem is when we run these rate myths past people, clearly a third of most adults subscribe to or endorse most of these. And let's face it, we had a presidential candidate who bragged about, and I'm going to say it straight out, grabbing women's pussies because he could get away with it. To me, that was a deal killer. I could never vote for anyone who could say that, whether they actually did it or were just bragging because they thought it sounded good. Either one is a losing perspective, that generates that statement. But still in all, we have about 45% of the American public that thought this is not a deal killer to become president of the United States. I don't agree. To me, someone who does that or brags about doing it, even not doing it, is certainly not leadership material. It's someone who has some serious problems and doesn't realize it, which is even scarier. So the myths about battered women abound, and the cycle of violence then is supported by many of these myths. So in this cycle of violence, what we're talking about in Walker here with the cycle of violence, it's a three-step process. Early batterers tend to be attentive, loving, but maybe overly controlling and certainly suspicious, looking at bank books, checking emails of their partner, texts, etc., trying to control their behavior. At some point, the tension-building phase occurs, and this is where some disappointment occurs. It could be something as simple as dinner is late on the table. It could be any number of things. The house isn't clean enough. Whatever it is. Then we see increased criticism of the partner, maybe some minor physical assault. This then turns into the end of step 2, kind of this acute battering incidents, and this is where the serious abuse occurs. Finally, we have the phase of contrition. This is where the batterer apologizes for the attack, promises to reform, I'll never do it again, I don't know what was wrong with me, and things calm down, once again attentive and loving, until the next battering incident. Why don't victims get more help? Well, part of the problem with victims getting help is that people might have a rather dim view of the battery, if you like that term, themselves. Battered women are often met with deep uneasiness or even hostility. We talked about defensive attributions in the beginning, early in the course. That could be a component of this uneasiness or hostility, is a defensive attribution, that is a distancing oneself from the person who's being battered to reassure ourselves that it couldn't happen to us. People are often cast as delusional alarmists. That is, they're doormats, they are overreacting to very simple things. Oh my God, it was just a little push, it was no big deal, you're really blowing this out of proportion. And they're often charged with and found guilty of, these battered women, serious crimes if they retaliate. Retaliation is not a great strategy in this situation. Only a small minority kill their mates, but those that do are almost always prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Again, the legal system takes a dim view of people taking the law into their own hands, failing to understand that the situation may have made it appear required to the battered woman in that she gets no support from the very system that goes on to prosecute her later for her retaliation. So, battered woman syndrome is simply a syndrome, a constellation of symptoms that are typical or typify being battered. So, women will fall into a state of learned helplessness, and Martin Seligman brought us this idea that if we, over time, find that nothing we do seems to change the situation, then many of us fall into a mode of just not doing anything. That is, we've learned to become helpless. We see increased domination by the batterer, socially isolated, economic dependent, like I referred to earlier, control the cell phone, checking text messages, emails, etc. may become part of the batterer's strategy, monitoring the telephone in other ways. Controlling the finances, so women don't have the financial freedom to necessarily leave. They become financially dependent, and this can tie into the support of the children as well. As a result, women become more and more fearful, and most believe the batterer will eventually kill them, that it's only a matter of time. Other traits that are occurring here, we see shattered self-esteem. That is, I must be so low that this is happening to me. Maybe women come to believe they deserve it. They feel guilty, maybe that they're causing it, and if they were better partners, then in fact this wouldn't be necessary. They experience shame that this is going on, shame in the relationship. Maybe they brag to their friends that their man was the best man ever. And again, I'm focusing on a very stereotypic heterosexual relationship. What I'm saying certainly could apply to different types of relationships as well. The rage, but the rage necessarily has to often be suppressed, because if they express the rage to their partner, it might just further incite battering incidents. And resentment for their partner, perhaps resentment for their children that they feel are tying them to this relationship and that they can't leave, they have to stay for the children. Resentment of themselves and their own decision, or society in general. One thing we notice, and this is similar to acute stress disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder victims, is we see hypervigilance. So now they become ultra sensitive to stimuli in the environment. They often become very adept at predicting partner violence. That is, they become very adept at noticing the signs that lead up to a battering incident and attempt to prepare for it. But if learned helplessness is part of the constellation of symptoms, then they simply become aware that it's going to happen and they're helpless to do anything about it. So, battered woman syndrome. I say, hey, I've got battered woman syndrome. This is why I killed my partner. Is it a good defense? Is it going to work? Is the jury going to support it? Nope. Most women who kill their abusive partners are in fact convicted. It's hard to make a self-defense claim, because people who engage in the myths are going to say, well, you could have left, you could have told somebody, you could have called the police, you could have done something. And you chose not to, you chose to take this route, take it into your own hands, and therefore, you want to take things into your own hands, you're going to have to be responsible for them. Further exacerbating this problem is at the time of the killing, many batterers are somehow defenseless. They've been drugged, they're drunk, they're asleep, they're passed out. Remember, you might not know the case of Lorena Bobbitt, but Lorena Bobbitt was being battered by her husband, and eventually she had had enough of this. While he was asleep, she pulled back the covers, took her sewing scissors, and cut off his penis. Yeah, that was her response to the battering incidents. Of course, her husband awoke in much pain. She ran out of the house, interestingly, still clutching the penis in her hand, got in her car, sped away, and as she was driving her car away, she in fact noticed she still had the penis in her hand and tossed it out the car window. Yes, truth can sometimes stranger than fiction. Actually, the paramedics who arrived at the scene saw the penis, put it on ice, and it was reattached for Mr. Bobbitt. It's rumored that he went on to then develop a porn career. I don't know about that part. Regardless, battered woman syndrome is a reality, but it rarely is the linchpin of a good defense. Now, we move away from women, but to children and abuse. A third to a fifth of all women, maybe a seventh of all men, were sexually abused before age 18. And this is a huge problem, and the abuse largely comes from family members or people close to the family. We often like to portray these evil sex molesters, that we can identify by their strange appearance out on the street, hanging in the shadows, etc., and make that the target. The real issue is in the home, and it's with the family. A fifth of children experience an injury as a result of abuse. 1,500 children die as a result of abuse each year. 80% of them are killed by their parents. So this is a significant problem. Consequences of child abuse, short term, what do we see? What do we observe in the children? We may see an increased prevalence of increased mood or anxiety disorders. We may see increased sexual behavior, or inappropriate conversation. If you got a 5 or 6 year old in a daycare situation, a school situation, that is describing something that you kind of look at yourself and say, whoa, I didn't ever know about that until I was like 13. And you got a 5 or 6 year old talking about some sex act or speaking about something that's just wildly out of what you would assume is appropriate for their age, this may be an indicator that something is going on. Impaired school performance is often the case. Children become distracted, they become anxious, and it's hard for them to focus on their studies. Long-term effects: abused children are more likely to develop mental disorders, suffer subsequent victimization, that is via Bill Swan's self-verification theory, something we'll talk about, and engage in criminal conduct as adults. That is, there's just kind of an erosion of moral processes as a result of this. Remember, as parents, as elders, we are responsible for providing a moral compass to our youngsters. To the extent that we fail in that, we can't expect them to really develop an effective moral compass. Now about rape and the psychology of rape. As with battered women, myths abound, almost to the point of ridiculous. Women can't be raped against their will. Well, that's a wonderful myth, but I would assume that most women are being raped against their will. Another myth: women secretly want to be raped. Well, yeah, right, whatever. Most accusations of rape are fixed. They really represent some kind of attack on the rapist itself, some kind of conspiracy against the rapist. And due to the one-on-one nature of the event, that is, usually we have an attacker, we have a rapist, we have a victim, and no one else involved in the situation, prosecution becomes problematic. Witnesses are not present, so it becomes a she said, he said, and given this, may cause real problems in trying the case, presenting evidence. The United States has the highest number of rapes in the world, 75 to 85 for every 100,000 females in the industrialized world. Probably a small number of rapes. We have no real idea how many are reported, and statistics estimates vary wildly here. Some people may say maybe as low as a fifth or a tenth of all rapes are actually reported. This is a difficult one to get at. The NCVS might help us out and say maybe 50-60% go unreported, but the numbers I just cited are far larger than that. Young women, young people, more likely to be victims in this situation. What are the effects for the victims? Well, rape trauma syndrome. So like battered wife syndrome, rape trauma syndrome shares some of the same qualities with adding some different ones. Fear, most certainly. Guilt, how was I responsible for this? What have I done? Shame, blame, self-blame especially. A sense of loss of autonomy, a control over oneself and one's own choices. Or a loss of control over the body. A lack of trust. Right? And then we see disturbances in functioning on top of those emotional responses. Changes in sleeping and eating patterns. Sleep might be interfered with. There might be compensatory eating, or there might be a loss of appetite. Social withdrawal, not wanting to interact with people. There may be problems in sexual functioning. That is, a woman is raped and now has difficulty engaging in the sex act with her partner, and we can imagine the difficulty there. Reliving the circumstance, especially when the stimuli situation and the behaviors could be so similar. There may be changes in lifestyle behavior. So we see behavioral changes such as obsessive checking the door, checking the windows. Is it locked, right? Are the lights on? Are the lights off? Major life changes, maybe a move, a change of job, right? Especially if the place of residence or the place of employment is somehow attached to the rape. It may be necessary to the woman for her sense of safety and security to change those things up. And this can be a tremendous financial hardship for the woman, especially if she's attained some level of seniority in her position or, is secure in her household. More likely to get divorced. That is, if married, the partner may not be able to recover from the fact that the partner was raped. And I know that sounds like the most chump thing on the planet, and call it for what it is. What is rape? What does the legislature, what do court decisions say? Basic definition is just non-consenting sexual contact by force or coercion. Until the 1980s, and this, go back old school, and it doesn't take us very far back in the Wayback Machine to see this, 4/5 of states, that's 80% of the states, imposed a resistance standard. So before 1980, if you didn't resist, it wasn't rape, right? So resistance was required regardless of the potential fear of the consequences of the resistance. States didn't differ between different degrees of rape or different types of rape, and states back then didn't think of spousal rape back prior to the 80s, that, spouse, the woman is responsible to satisfy the man's sexual needs basically upon the man's demand. Obviously this has changed. One of the big problems with rape and the unreported nature of rape is what we know about what happens to the rape victim in the courtroom. Rape victims often complain that they feel like they're the ones on trial rather than their attacker. There can be tremendous scrutiny and tremendous levels of embarrassing questions about previous sexual habits, partners, behaviors. Rape shield laws were designed then to help insulate the victim from these kind of noxious attacks on their behavior. All states now have some form of rape shield laws, and they vary. Typically prohibit inquiries about the defendant's sexual past except for special circumstances, and once we know that there's an exception, then that kind of pulls the lid off the pot. In reality, rape victims are still subjected to intense scrutiny by lawyers, judges, and jurors. Victim blame, and as I'll go back to it again and again, defensive attributions rear their ugly head once again. Now, what do we know then? The rape shield laws are designed to protect us from protect the victim from discussion of their past sexual history, but how does it work out? How do people actually perceive this? Let's get scientific for a minute. So if we study rape laws and develop a study to test whether some jurisdictions classified as prejudicial really was, the independent variable in this study was type of info presented about the victim, and then the dependent variables we see in many of the studies we're going to talk about in this class is the conviction of the defendant and or sometimes the amount of time the defendant is sentenced to. What do we see? Well, the restrictive straits were right. Mock jurors were less likely to convict when they heard evidence about the victim's past sexual history. So once that past sexual history comes into the testimony as part now of the trial proceedings, we're going to see a reduction in convictions. Yeah. In mock jury settings, what do we see? We can study reactions to rape victims. Mock jurors who are low in empathy for rape victims, rape attacker, are less responsible. I mean, that's a pretty obvious statement, but it's important to understand. This can tie back to a person's rape myths. So if I have an increased level of rape myths, right, seeing victims as being more deserving, I'll have lower empathy, and then I'm going to find the attacker less responsible as a result of this. They also tend to interpret the facts differently, and this is going to be something we're going to discuss in part 2 of jury trials, is the actual process of assessing evidence by the jurors within the context of the jury box. One thing we need to discuss, and interestingly, when I was here at Ohio State, I don't know, it must have been about 2000, 1999, 2000, I was a new graduate student. And date rape became very well publicized on the Ohio State campus and its surrounding environs. It seemed like there was a lot of date rape going on. It was receiving a lot of attention to the point where people were starting to become somewhat suspicious of each other. It was kind of driving a wedge between men and women on the Ohio State campus, or at least beginning to. As a result, I actually did a date rape study for my master's thesis. I'm not going to get into that because it's a lengthy description, but fascinating results. Let's just talk about acquaintance rape. 3/4 of rape victims are committed by someone the victim knows. So remember we said about 75% of people murders are by someone knows, so are the rapes. It's different from stranger assault, these types of acquaintance rapes. They tend to occur on the weekends, as you can see on your slide, late in the evening. They tend to involve situations in which the victim or attacker have been using drugs and alcohol. And I think alcohol is underplayed here. If people want to get someone to lower their standards, lower their inhibitions, alcohol is really the #1 choice. Let's face it, alcohol generates GABA. GABA shuts off the prefrontal cortex first, so the best judgment decision making, people are being deprived as they drink alcohol. So their inhibitions diminish, and attackers know this and often ply their victims with alcohol for this reason. Obviously, date rape drugs like roofies, etc., can really facilitate the rape, but these are difficult to employ. It's easy to put a pill in someone's drink, but when this person begins to pass out and you're seen leaving with them, this can cause witnesses to become alerted, etc. I don't think the data doesn't show that date rape drugs are the big deal. Let's just put it right back on alcohol. Some people, pointed way back in the day, especially in the days of reefer madness, 1930s, that people would be plied with marijuana and then they lost all inhibition. I think if there were good studies to this, we would find something very different. People who consume cannabis might in fact have a tendency to become more rather than less inhibited. So I don't know if that's exactly... alcohol is the go-to drug in the date rapist's arsenal. Okay, what else do we know? Let's see. Date rape doesn't usually require weapons, verbal threats, blackmail, and physical prowess, just simply overpowering a weaker victim. Also associated with dates in remote locations, so if someone says, hey, let's go out to the woods, and park out where there's nobody around, it might be time to get suspicious about the ulterior motives to that kind of adventure. Also, if males pay all the expenses, some males may believe that this in fact entitles them then to some kind of return on their investments, so to speak. Now, when we talk about post-victimization disorders, either acute stress disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder, and these are the current slide, the next slide, we often think of soldiers, we think of the Vietnam veteran, etc., who had horrendous levels of post-traumatic stress disorder. If it was World War I, they were calling it shell shock. If it was World War II, they were calling it battle fatigue. And women who are being raped in their parking garage or their apartment or on a campus somewhere are suffering symptoms that are just the same. These are traumatic events. It really doesn't matter what instigated the traumatic event, as long as the traumatic event is interpreted as traumatic, threatening to one's personal view and personal safety, then it can start the cascade of symptoms associated with ASPD or PTSD. What are they? Dissociative symptoms, and I find dissociative symptoms fascinating. That is the idea that the mind attempts to disassociate from the self, or the self tries to disassociate from, it's hard to even know what. But this really is a defensive mechanism that the brain attempts to protect the self by disassociating portions of the self that were harmed from the portions of the self that need to function. So we may see a sense of numbing, a sense of detachment, maybe an absence of emotion, a reduction of awareness, maybe more of a self-focus. People persistently re-experience a traumatic event, they can't get it out of their memory. So while we talked about some of the liabilities and the failings of memory, here memory gets really good and it becomes repetitive outside of the person's control. There's usually an impairment of the ability to complete necessary tasks for the person, and with acute stress disorder, what we're talking about is 2 days to 4 weeks after the event, and usually lasting a month or two. When we see an extension, that is a late onset, then we might be looking at calling it post-traumatic stress disorder. Also, if it persists past 2, 4, 6 months, then post-traumatic stress disorder becomes the new diagnosis. Another thing we see with PTSD is intense guilt from surviving when others did not, and that would be more of a soldier than necessarily a rape situation. Phobic avoidance of situations that resemble or symbolize a trauma. If a woman's, let's say, raped in a parking garage, she may find it impossible to in fact park in another parking garage, or may in fact experience intense anxiety just driving past a parking garage. Impaired affect modulation, that sounds really fancy. What it means is my level of emotional expression now fluctuates well beyond my control. Feelings of hopelessness, maybe learned helplessness, despair, hostility, increased risk of phobia, and the phobias can be a myriad phobia: social, obsessive compulsive disorder, agoraphobia, right? Fear of the marketplace, know your ancient Greeks. Substance-related disorders, as attempting to numb the pain from the rape. Finally, let's kind of tie it up here. Contributing disorders to violence, and I think again I'm going to promote psychology of emotion. I do want to talk about an aggression and violence, especially as it relates to anger, hostility, and especially as it relates to doctrine of Acco, one of my professors at University of California, Irvine. We'll discuss that in the future. Let's talk about some contributing disorders to violence. Well, antisocial personality disorders. People who've been diagnosed with ASPD certainly may be violent prone and more prone to create harm to victims. Psychopathy, let's face it, if someone lacks empathy, this can be a kind of a license to harm other people, right? And borderline personality disorder. That is, you know, the wildly fluctuating level of self-esteem and need for reinsurance. I referenced the movie, oh shoot, I'm forgetting it now. Never mind that. But borderline personality disorder, these rapid fluctuations and this intense love towards a partner that kind of cycles to an intense hatred where there's no in-between, can often be the cause. The Betty Broderick story was the name of that movie. I already told you about that. So up to 40% of batters display some symptoms that are consistent with borderline personality disorder. Narcissism, right? And we have that dark triad. So we have narcissism as one of the legs of the dark triad. That is a feeling of entitlement. This is my woman and I'm entitled to do what I want and no one can tell me what to do. And screw anyone who tries to tell me what to do. And that's basically what I have for Lecture 6. I hope this was helpful. I think we should just say hello to Alice here for a minute. Come on, Alice. Say hello to Alice. So there's Alice, and she wants to say goodbye. And here comes Bootsy, because Bootsy's jealous. So let's say goodbye to Bootsy. Ah, Bootsy. Ah, there we are. My name is Boots. And let's call it good.